thing I failed to mention is, the first two lectures are being done by our, really the two most experienced club flight instructors. Cookie has taught for about 35 years, if I'm not mistaken.
30 years of teaching.
30 years of teaching, and he's taught many students. And same deal with Erik. These guys really have been around the block in both doing these kinds of things and also making, getting it across to folks. And I'm really excited to get Erik here to tell us about how to find the next thermal. So let's give him a round of applause and get started.
All right. So there's nothing more deadly than being locked in a room, especially a dark room, all day, listening to glider pilots drone on. So no, leave it on for a second. So first things first, can everybody stand up? Chris, if it's a miracle, we'll give it. Raise your hand. So of those of you standing up, now, if you have flown a silver distance or more, remain standing. Everybody else, go ahead and sit down. All right. So I just want to know what I'm working with here.
Target-rich environment.
As long as I got did it legally.
You did it. You did it. So you're still standing. Okay. Now, if you have made at least a gold distance, remain standing. Everybody else, sit down. All right. Smaller group. Look around a little bit. Okay. If you have done a diamond distance, 500K or greater, remain standing. Everybody else sit down. All right, now it's getting to be a small group. 750s, 750 diplomas. Look around. Well, you don't have to have the diploma. Peter's done, all kinds of ones. All right, so it's a pretty elite group here. Thousands remain standing. All right, smaller groups still. More than 1,000. These two guys. So. All right. So you can turn the lights down.
How about if you own both of the 1000K 126s?
What if you have the wing pins for the 1000K 126? All right. So, guys, Erik Mann, I've been instructing for 25 years and flying. I flew my first cross country in '87, so whatever that works out to be, 32 years ago. I can't do math anymore, and you'll see why in a minute. Very passionate about cross country and racing. So this was a perfect setup because if you paid any attention to Cookie's stuff, I'm building directly off of what he's talking about. And in fact, what I'll kind of say is think about spend most of the time thinking about what Cookie talked about finding that thermal, centering the thermal, optimizing your climb and thermal, right? If you can do one, that means you know how to thermal. Now the trick to going faster and further is doing that 2, 3, 4, 5, 15, 20 times in a row. And that's what I'm going to focus on a little bit more. But first, a quick story. Many of you from the ACA Club, they know Tony Benson. So Tony had one of the best wits of any pilot you've ever seen. And about 15 years ago, there was a pilot who was in the local area. He's one of the best stick and rudder guys I ever flew with. He flew everything. He flew helicopters. He used to ferry single-engine Cessnas to Europe in hard IMC. I mean, the guy could fly. But like a lot of you, he learned gliding as an add-on. He actually had, I think, 3 solos, and then he got his glider rating. And he had never had dual. And Tony used to say it was very easy to know where this particular pilot, and he got into racing too, by the way, and it was very easy to know where he was going to end up because it was essentially a ballistic trajectory of wherever he went through the gate. That's basically where he was going to land. So the higher the gate was, the further out he landed. He basically would get 1, maybe 2 thermals out on course, and then that was it. So what I want to talk about is how do you avoid the ballistic trajectory and actually start stringing together more and more thermals. Yeah, glider lawn darts, exactly. Now, part of this, besides just staying in the air, is if you looked around, right, forget about ridge soaring for a minute. In order to do a diamond distance flight, which is probably the most that many people here are going to want to do, you've got to be able to fly a 500K, which is 300 miles. And in a statistic that I just made up, fewer than 20% of the pilots who do their silver do diamond. But actually, if you looked around the room, that's actually probably about what we have in this room, right? So most people, if they're serious about racing in cross country, they might get to their 300K. Fewer get to 500, very few get to do really long distances. And part of the reason is they're stuck flying around in club class gliders at 40 to 45 miles an hour, right? So what I want to talk about is how do you make sure that you're not always stuck achieving 40 to 45 miles an hour? Because if you look at the math, and this is the only math in the entire session, in order to fly your diamond distance, it's going to take you almost 7 hours. Now, around here in the East Coast, there's a precious few days in the year when we have 7 hours of really good soaring. For the Brits, they launch at 8 in the morning on bird farts and they fly till 7 o'clock at night and they're all happy. Here, we like to actually be able to stay in the air with 2 to 3 knots to 4,000 feet before we start our big flying. So most of what I'm going to talk about is how do you string together thermals in a way that allows you to get from 40 miles an hour to 45 miles an hour to maybe averaging 50 and breaking 50 and 55. Okay? Because I think if you can't reliably break 45 to 50, you're going to have a hard time doing long flights, and you're going to have a hard time having fun as you get more into the racing. So this is a little bit about how do I connect enough good thermals to be able to actually make some distance, right?
Eric,
Yes, sir.
the little light there that you have, no,
Oh,
the one
yeah,
behind
yeah,
on the table there,
Yep.
This one?
yeah, it's so bright coming
Got it.
across, it's very.
Got it, got it. All right, now, looking at my demographic here, and especially my age band, I expect a number of people to be able to answer this next question. Anybody know? Say it up louder.
Earth, Wind, Fire?
Earth, wind, and fire. Exactly. So what do these guys have to do with soaring? And Cookie touched on this, so I'm going to spend more time, and we're going to make this a lot more interactive. All right. So Cookie talked about this earlier. I'm going to spend more time on it, right? Carl Streetic has this great saying. He says, nothing good ever happens in the cockpit, right? Everything interesting happens outside. So the first thing that I encourage people to do is look out the damn window. A glance at the airspeed indicator, a glance at the vario is all you need. All the good stuff happens outside. And as we put more gadgets in the cockpit, we're spending more and more time looking at our moving maps, and we're not looking outside. So this may be a little hard for you folks in the back. Anybody, it says where it is, but actually I don't think it gives it away. Anybody know where that is relative to where we all fly? Yeah, Rick,
Right, just down by,
your backyard.
yeah, between Reading and,
Yeah.
Kutztown.
So this is a very common part of the Governor's Cup, which is an area that we all fly fairly frequently. And it's actually really representative of what we're going to talk about, right? Everything that you need to know about the terrain and the conditions is evident in this picture. Now, it's not a great shot, but over here, I'm coming from Pottstown, Reading area. Reading's kind of down here. And I'm coming over a lot of high rolling ground. I'd call these low hills. They're probably 800,000 feet max, maybe less, something like that. I've got a big town over here. Kutztown, which is the turn point, is right about up where I am here. And then I've got what we lovingly refer to as the Kutztown Valley, aka the sinkhole of death, right? So the first thing here is whenever you start flying cross country, right? And Cookie talked about this earlier. One of the things to do is start forming a mental picture of what's outside your window, right? So what's good? High rolling ground, quarries. There's a junkyard somewhere down here. I think that's the parking lot of that little mini ski area. There's stuff going on out there. And when we were talking about earlier, when you're down low, right, that's the bottom third, you're really focusing on that stuff. When you're up high, you're taking more of a macro picture, right? Hey, I'm heading in to the high ground east of Kutztown, right? I should be thinking about getting high, right? I'm thinking about what's going to happen in the next 20 minutes? Well, I really want to try to get high over here because typically I'm going to have better thermals. Hopefully the sky looks better. I've got to have enough reach to glide out across the softer areas until I get over here to where the rolling hills start again. That's just one of many, many things that you can see in that picture. The bigger point is oftentimes when I ask somebody when you're just getting your silver distance, right, you're so focused on navigation, you're so focused on basically having a very high level picture, you're not thinking about what the terrain and the earth and the conditions around me are going to be doing. So that's just the first takeaway. So let me ask, and I want to make this very interactive from the folks here, right? So if you kind of look at this picture, what are some of the things that, I don't know if any of you in the back can see it, but you know, are there any other things that you see just from this picture? And again, it's a tilted 3D, so it's not perfect. It's not as high res as I'd like. Anything else that leaps out to folks here? What else do you see? Town, yep, Fleetwood. What else? Lots of fields. So the good news is if you get low in the sink, there's lots of places to land, right? There's a lake in here somewhere, and we're going to talk about that later. Somewhere over here, right?
Lake would be
Yeah,
off to your left more.
yeah, right over in here, right? There's a very marshy area. So generally speaking, when we talk about starting, you know, from a big picture thinking, right, I want to try to bias my flying toward the better ground, which is typically high ground, right? Great if there's mountains, ridges. I want to stay away from heavily irrigated areas or low ground, right? A good example up by where Hank flies is there are these onion fields. If you go into that area low, you know, your day's over, right? So that's kind of forming the macro picture. And again, Cookie talked about it earlier. When I'm really low, I'm looking at individual features and kind of saying, hey, you know, maybe if I fall off of this, I'll probably find something blowing off of this area here, as opposed to maybe going right out here in this irrigated area. It may be worse. When I'm up high, I'm just trying to form a mental picture. All right, so here's the audience participation part. Real quickly. Think about it. All right, for all you guys out there. So I'll just give you a giveaway. Bobby Templin is the human topo map. You ask Bobby where Molly's nipple is, and he'll be able to tell you not only where Molly's nipple is, but what are the 7 different features within 10 miles of there, right? So
And there's a little bit of context there.
Yes.
So most people that outside the club might not know about that.
we'll just leave that as it is. That's a rock formation.
Eric, I'm sorry, it's worthy of mention of the hot bottom club. Which is
So,
like-
so just show of hands of the folks that are here for the seminar. How many of you think of yourself as a human topo map? Daniel, okay, back there, 1 or 2. Kind of tentative hands, right? A lot of hang glider pilots probably are human topo maps because you're so used to knowing every bit of it, right? How many of you would kind of rate yourself a B? I generally know what's going on. Okay, so look around as you see the hands going up, right? I'd say that's probably half. How about C? Okay, not always, right? And D. There we go. So I actually went on a retrieve years ago, and this is a true story. Hank knows who I'm talking about. This guy was a legendarily bad glider pilot and a wonderful gentleman. And he was so unaware when he was flying because he was fiddling with this was when we first got little handheld GPSs and things. I pulled him out of a pretty wrecked glider that had basically crashed into the side of a harvested, not a harvested, what do you call it, when you cut down an orchard? A cleared orchard up near where Kathy flies. And he literally didn't know where he was. He had no idea what happened in the last 5 minutes before he hit the ground because he was so busy staring at his instruments and staring at his GPS and just basically losing situational awareness on the outside world. So, number 1 recommendation is...
He retired after 13 crashes.
Yes. He was almost a triple black ace, which is rare. Okay, Cookie talked about this earlier. What's the second thing, right? So know where I am, know what the terrain looks like, have a clue about what the area is. The second thing is wind, right? And I think Cookie talked about it. In the interest of time, I won't feed it again. But I got to tell you, most of the good glider pilots that I've flown with, and this is the Carl Streetics, the Hank Nixons, the John Seymours, whatever, they know not just, hey, it's northwest, but when they're flying, they've got a mental picture of what northwest means relative to where they are right now. Oh, the wind's off my left wing and maybe quartering tailwind, right? So that when they do what Cookie was talking about earlier, when they turn, they know what upwind is, right? I have the same experience Cookie has. A lot of the times with early students or even late students or people that are doing a tune-up, I say, all right, level out and fly into the wind. and Cookie said that earlier, right? There's this pregnant pause Like, huh? That wind, yeah, where is that wind, right? So why does wind matter? And everybody knows this, right? The most obvious one for what we're trying to talk about is streeting, and we're going to come back to that. But knowing where the wind is has a huge impact on clouds, on how the clouds are going to line up, and also where you're going to potentially find the lift relative to the cloud, and what you're going to do when you leave a cloud, right? So wind awareness is the second thing. Ridge and mountain is a whole specialty thing, and I don't want to talk about ridge flying per se, but obviously if the wind is blowing against a hill, and better yet the sun's shining on that hill, probably a really good place to find thermals kicking off of the mountain, right? Conversely, probably don't want to be low on the backside of a mountain for obvious other reasons, right? And in fact, we had an accident not too many years ago at a race. The guy was flying essentially down the backside of a working ridge, not realizing that he was on the wrong side of the ridge, right? So that's a combination of poor situational awareness from terrain and not knowing where the wind was. So don't be that guy. I don't want to talk about wave today, other than the fact that when it gets windy, normally there's more going on in the air than most people realize, right? So knowing not just the direction of the wind, but how much wind there is, and knowing if the wind is changing. If you ask a good glider pilot, he or she will tell you, hey, I think the wind shifted. Every time I got to about 3,500, 4,000, I think the wind was shearing to the northwest, because they're paying attention and they're forming that mental image. So again, it's the same thing that Cookie was talking about. Form those images, process a lot of information. You know, you gotta be paying attention. All right, second quiz. Self-rating. Think about it. All right. How many of you are A? How many of you really pay attention to the wind? I would imagine we're Schwartz. Any ridge soaring, Bobby, right? Any serious ridge, Daniel, I'm sure, hang glider pilots, right? Anybody that's done a lot of hang gliding or flies ridge soaring, the wind is your life, right? So those of us that do a lot of that stuff, we always know where the wind is. How many of you are B? At least you're aware. Okay. How about C? All right, there's a few of you. I don't need to know about D. Just do me a favor. I don't want to do your BFR or fly dual in a closed cockpit with you. All right. So that's wind. And the last part of earth, wind, and fire is obviously the heating and the sun. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm going to make it more practical. But one of the things that really good glider pilots do is they pay attention not just to the cumulus clouds, but they're looking out and they're saying, hey, what's the sun doing now? And a good example where we fly is if you think about the ridges, right? Our ridge gets sun in the morning on the southeast side. Sorry, I had to think about that for a minute. On the back side of the ridge, and especially if there's nooks and crannies, a lot of times there's little bowls and things that just get heated up all morning, especially on light wind days, or if you're trying to get going early for thermals, etc. And the back side, the other side, what we think of as the front side of the ridge for ridge soaring, is in the shade. And then as the day goes on, the sun moves around, and different parts of the area get heated. A bigger one that a lot of guys that are paying attention notice, oftentimes we get these mare's tails or small bands of cirrus, and they'll black out an area, right? And somebody that's paying attention says, hey, wait a minute, that area is cooling down right now, right? I don't want to go driving in there low in an area that's been in the shade for the last half hour, because probably not going to be very good thermals, right? But oftentimes, right on the boundaries of those things, there's a discontinuity. Oftentimes, there can be really good lift just on the edges, right? So you're forming that mental picture. What's the sun doing? Sometimes they're spread out, and there'll be a large area that's black on the ground, dark, no sun hitting the ground, but there's areas of sun. And oftentimes in the spring, the secret to success is go to where the sun is, right? And all you need is a little sun on the ground, and boom, you're going to get thermals. A lot of times the beginning person isn't putting all this stuff together, right? They're just doing what they did before, and boy, it's sunny over by Newton, and it's gray everywhere over by the ridge, and what do? They go fly over by the ridge, right? So just pay attention to where the sun is, where the shadows are, and make sure that other things being equal, right, I want to go where the sun's shining. Simple stuff. But again,
Earlier you said go
Yeah.
for the high ground.
what's that?
Earlier you said head for the high ground.
Everything is situational, Boris. It's complicated.
Eric said,
So what's the point here, right? The point here is everything I just talked about there was nothing going on in the cockpit of any importance. Everything that I talked about in the first 10, 15 minutes is happening outside, right? And yet, every time I fly with people, especially as more and more beginning guys are getting these gee-whiz flight computers, right? They're staring at the lubber line, or they're looking at the circle distance, or they're looking at how many feet above glide they are. And all the exciting stuff that can keep you in the air and get you going faster is happening out there. So if you took nothing else away from today on my talk, it's look out the damn window. Seriously, that is it. And you guys had Carl here. I don't know how many of you came for Carl and people like that, or Seymour. After you fly with these guys, you'll hear all these great stories. Oh, did you see that little brush fire over by Silver Creek? Or, hey, did you see that gaggle of hawks over by the mine? Or, hey, did anybody notice that guy cutting hay with the 4 combines in a row on that field? And most of the guys are looking around going, I don't know, I didn't even see anything, right? So that's advice number 1. Now, I laughed earlier, Cookie, because we stole the same artwork.
that says it all. You don't need to know any more than that.
I chopped off the bottom piece because I wanted to make a point. So the first part was Earth, Wind, and Fire. Now, most of the time in the East Coast when we're flying, not all the time, but oftentimes we're flying, there's some types of clouds. Hopefully there's cumulus clouds. Sometimes there's little haze domes. Some days it's blue, in which case the cloud stuff doesn't really matter. But the biggest thing that I notice, and this is the transition from what Cookie was talking about to trying to string them together, is most people are happy when they can get one climb, right? And Cookie talked about take the first climb up, whatever. Now what do you do? Well, the trick is, now I've got to look out the window and make a call, right? Based on the terrain, based on the wind, and especially when I'm up high, based on the clouds, where am I going to go next, right? So that's the next big thing, and we'll spend a little time on it. But just like Cookie said, there's a lot of shades. He likes black and white, but in cloud reading, there's a lot of shades of gray, no pun intended, right? There's, this is the idealized model of a forming hue. Yeah, it's kind of got the cotton ball shape happening. It's got a dark bottom. It's got some definition to it. Here's one that's probably late in the stage. It's really started to bubble up. It's probably got multiple cores in it. Nice dark gray flat bottom, and this one kind of looks like an amorphous blob. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because all of you are going to learn to do this. I can give you a picture to imprint, but the suggestion is pay attention over the course of the day to what clouds look like and which ones are working and which ones aren't. Rijard in our club is very good at that. Like he'll tell you, oh yeah, every cloud and the sunny, windy side, and everything was better over here, and all the ones that kind of looked like this were the best ones. And he's very good at stringing together a number of climbs. So the point is, as you're climbing in one thermal, right, not only are you trying to stay in that thermal, but you're looking out and saying, okay, which individual cloud, or maybe which street or which group of clouds is my next set of climbs? So that's the next thing, is once you got individual climbs, now you got to start looking out and saying, I've got 2 or 3 of them. Now the biggest mistake people make, and you know what, Daniel, I'm not going to use that because I think I'm going to, but
You want to use the...
no, I don't want to use the camera. Nobody's going to be able to see this, but let me try to talk you through it. The biggest problem is, let's say I'm trying to fly from here to Cookie. So Cookie's right in the back, right back there. And I look out and he's 25, 30 miles away. And I look out my window, and it's kind of blue and scraggly looking right at Cookie. And he's pretty far away. But over here toward Gus, about 15, 20 degrees of course line, there's a line of beautiful white puffy Q. In fact, with the wind facing that way, they're all streeting up, and they've got nice dark bottoms, right? What's the beginner going to do? Or what's the airline pilot going to do, right? The airline pilot wants vectors. So he says, I want to fly a heading of 250 and maintain 70 knots, and I'm going to fly 250 and maintain 70 knots, right? Even though he's flying through sync the entire time. I had a guy, he was actually flew G4s for Johnson & Johnson. He was very good at being told how to fly. He could fly the pattern perfectly if I gave him heading to the IP, and then I basically walked him through every turn, and he was great. He kept airspeed, heading, ball, needle, everything was great. But as soon as I said, all right, go get from here to there without vectors, he was totally lost, because he'd never looked out the window and said, hey, it looks better over here. So the point is, if I'm looking out the window, and I've got to go from point A to point B, and it's 30 miles away, I can afford a heading change of 20, 25, 30 degrees, as long as I'm going to be flying in really good air. And at the end of it, especially if that's leaving me upwind of where I want to get to, I've got a little jog downwind and I'm home free. There's actually the guy who started my glider club, wrote his senior thesis on this topic, and there's a lot of math behind it. But basically the theory is, if you commit, and Cookie talked about flying with some kind of, purpose, right? Pick that line, optimize on that line, you're going to get there higher and faster than you would have if you went driving straight ahead, got down to 500 feet above ground and found a miracle thermal to climb up. So the big point is picking energy lines is really the difference between having to turn all the time and being able to waft along comfortably up at cloud base and not constantly being down in the ground climbing out. Daniel.
Eric, that for the more experienced folks here, this idea of picking clouds together and string them together, I think is very intuitive. But maybe for the benefit of some of the beginners, could you illustrate basically?
Can I illustrate? So,
Yep.
here's what it looks like out the window, right? Now, again, I know the resolution of this isn't really great. This is up by Hanks. This is actually up north of West Point, yeah. This is facing the Hudson River. Poughkeepsie, or whatever it is over here, Dutchess County Airport. Beautiful day, I think last summer or the summer before. So this is very typical of how you're going to find yourself, right? Just climbed up. I'm at 5,000 plus feet, and I'm trying to get somewhere over here. Actually, that's Dutchess County Airport, I think, that blob right there, right? Well, let's just say this doesn't look great right here. It's kind of a blue hole. But right over here, I see a line of clouds. In fact, you see these shadows on the ground? Oftentimes when you're up high, you can't see the next cloud. But if you look out on the ground, you see a line of black dots, right? That's my cloud streak. So what I'm going to do to try to get over here, I'm going to go like this. I'm going to fly over here until I get over the river, get up about here, and then I'll hang a left, probably fly to this cloud and come down. I've made a deviation, but distance-wise, I maybe added a mile or two, but for 10 minutes, I was flying in 2 knots up, as opposed to flying through a blue hole, having to cross the river and get over to the other side low. So the big thing that people do that are getting from 40 miles an hour to 45 miles an hour is they spend less time circling and more time flying in lift, straight. And they also fly where there's more good clouds, so they spend more time with a good chance of finding a thermal rather than finding the single thermal hanging out in the middle of nowhere. Does that make sense? So let me pause here for a second, because this is not always intuitive. Boris.
Yeah, on the previous slide, you had the cloud types.
Yep.
New, mature, decaying.
Whoops.
Is there like,
I got it.
I often find myself, right, you fly and you think, okay, here, good cloud, and on a task or whatever, you go to turn point and think, well, on the way back, maybe I
Yep.
can do the same one again. Is there a rule of thumb or some math for like
Yeah.
the life cycle of a cloud? Because sometimes I think, wow, this cloud looks really good, by the time I get there,
Yeah.
it's shitty.
You know what, though? I think every day is different. I think some days the cycle...
Is it minutes? Is it hours? I don't know.
No.
When you see like time-lapse videos of the sky, it's really interesting. Like,
Yeah.
you see
The
like, how
The answer is that depends.
Yeah. Yep. See, there's some days, my sense is that on a good May day or a June day where there's a fresh breeze but not a very strong breeze, and there's great, it's called solar insolation. The rate of heating in the ground is very high. The thermal is kind of just, it's like a engine. It's going and going, and it's great. Other days, if it's either very windy or it's weaker, the thermals could be bubbly, and that bubble was just enough to get a decent climb, and 2 minutes later, there's nothing left. I don't think there's one...
There is a characteristic, though, that
Yeah.
you can tell, and that is, as you're climbing, does the thermal stay together well? That says it's in its early part of its cycle. And the other thing is, after you've bumped a few of these things, you get a sense of, are these thermals lasting a long time because they've got a lot of energy from the ground, or are they little bubbles that go
Right.
away? And if you've just got a good fast climb, a little bubble that went away, going back to the same place is
It's not going to work. Yep. Yep. Oftentimes, if you've got multiple gliders, another good clue is the guy down low isn't catching up, and you're actually pulling away. It's likely that you got the bubble and he or she didn't. Yeah, Daniel.
To illustrate, I think to just add on this point, there are, basically there are times where the bubble creates the cloud, or there's times essentially that the cloud is sucking up the bubbles below. That
Right.
basically most of the time, the thermals are not that big. I mean, the cycling will determine is the bubble bigger or smaller, but if you have nice big clouds and they're consistent, it's just that it's happening to it's basically a vacuum cleaner sucking them all up. But if the clouds are basically puffing away, that cloud, that basically in the next couple of minutes it's going to be gone.
Yep.
So it's a question of what's driving it.
So let me ask some of the folks that are here as students, right? And somebody be brave. You can, if you want to walk up, then do it. But take a second. I gave you some clues already, but what's everything you can sense from this picture? In other words, give me a brain dump of what you see. Yeah, go ahead.
Good day.
Okay, what else? So what makes it a good day?
There's plenty of clouds, there's definitely a lot of lifts. There's
Okay.
a lot of cumulus formed. You got streets, you got a little bit of wind.
Okay.
Um,
What about this cloud right here? Is there anything that you where would you go on that cloud just based on what you see right there? Somebody that's not a wind is blowing from actually behind me. Which side?
Sunny side.
Okay,
Right-hand
sunny
side.
side, near side. Yeah, I think it feels like right in here maybe.
Yeah, because it's a little darker there.
Yeah. In fact, right here, see this little shelf here? That might be the next big bubble on the upwind sunny side.
That's
Hey, good.
also a slightly old cloud. That
Yep.
cloud is on its downward side.
Yeah. Oh, tell me about it. Oh, tell me about it. So this was me, Greg. I think actually Greg's in the picture. We took this, we went across the river. Oh man, it's going great. We got over past the airport, and we turned around, and all these nice clouds that were here
What have you done?
weren't there anymore. And now we're on the other side of the river. It's getting late. It's 5 o'clock, 5:30. Anyway, so that's okay. That's one good point. The clouds. What else? Somebody else. What else do you notice there?
Who was it at the last one who said he's only made like 3 good jumps across the river going from east to west?
Yeah.
Is there a haze?
There's some haze, but what else? Well, it's also maybe just my canopy. What else? So there's some obvious features here. What's the big thing that leaps out?
Is that cloud, that shadow on the ground, is it from this cloud on this
Could be.
one? So
Yeah, it's
the sun
probably
is-
the sun's probably back here.
Okay,
So it
so
might be
that's
that
the
one.
sun angle, okay.
What about this? What about this thing here?
Yeah.
River.
It's a river.
It's the Hudson River, right?
Oh, it's a sinkhole.
That's the Hudson River.
You're gliding out at least 5 miles beyond that before you're going to have a climb.
Yeah. Did you hear what Hank said?
You got that, right.
So Hank, say that again.
You're going to glide out about 5 miles before you get a climb.
Right.
That's why there's a gap, and then you see another line of clouds up there.
Right. So again, now you've got the mental picture forming. Aha! I'm in a river valley. I've got moist, probably cool air. A lot of air actually flows up all the way from the Hudson Bay. I've got all this stuff going on. I've got a big, interesting patch over here. It turns out it's an airport, but it's also a big discontinuity. If I'm going to get low, maybe that's something. What else do you see? Shadows. Anything else interesting?
Just the white stuff along the.
Yeah, that's like the White Cliffs of Dover, right? I think that's actually a big quarry that's right up against the Hudson. So, problem is it's also right up against the river.
So do you find lift over that often, or mostly not because of the river?
We don't make that like
We don't go there.
we don't go there.
That's what I wanted to
Yeah,
know.
we don't go there.
Just landable fields on this side,
Yeah, lots of fields. Yep.
Those are what-
but you
Yep.
want to keep going.
Anyway, point being, and in fact, I'm even guessing. It looks to me like this is probably a local high spine running along here. It looks lower over here, lower over here. Point is, all this stuff is happening outside the window, right? And again, I'm not trying to give you everything you need to know, but the big takeaway is there's a ton of information when you look out the window to help you connect the dots next time you go. So okay, I got a couple more minutes. Now that was up high. Now Hank and Cookie earlier were talking about getting down low. Now this is low. forget about whether this is or isn't a ridge day. This was actually a ridge run crossing the Susquehanna going that way. But let's suppose I'm thermaling. Okay, now I'm not going to give stuff away here, but some of the student folks here, think about what we talked about earlier. Okay, and now I'll give you a couple pieces of information. The sun is about over here, and the wind is coming from over here. And the picture's not great. That's the Susquehanna River right there. And let's suppose it's not a ridge day. Let's suppose that the winds are maybe 5 to 10 out of the northwest. So they're coming from back here. So what do you do?
Stay on this side.
So Z, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Stay on this side.
Okay.
Most likely.
Stay on which side?
On our side.
The upwind side.
Upwind side.
Okay. And what else? How about those clouds back there?
No,
Far
too
away.
far. Too
Kathy?
far.
Can't get there from here.
Even if you're in the discus and not the 126.
Exactly. Can't get there from here. This does me no good, right? These are way too far away to matter. So my world right now is here. In fact, I'll make life easier for you. Let's actually say the wind is coming this way because you can actually see what's going on. So the wind is blowing from here. This is my world.
Yeah.
So what am I going to do?
That's when you're most likely to see birds.
Okay, great. Birds. I'm
You
looking out for
have
hawks.
fields, so
Yeah.
that's good too.
I turn left into that wind and
Yeah.
for something coming off those fields.
Well,
Triggered
hang on a minute.
mountain.
Hang on, Phil.
The thermals might be going.
Hang on a second, Paul. Hey, Philip, say that again.
So if you're on the top and you turn left, there's probably thermals that get triggered at the edge of that ridge. If that
Right in
wind's
here
coming
somewhere.
down. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Up that way.
Do I want to, let's say I'm still 1,000 feet above the ridge. Am I going to go head out into these brown fields over here first?
Go to the right.
No, stay on the ridge.
I'm going to stay high. I'm going to work the high ground until I can't work
Line
it.
up with the wind and then go into the direction.
Perfect.
If you try and hit the thermal from the side, it's a hard profile to hit.
Yep.
If you can line up with the wind, upwind or
Perfect.
downwind, you have a big blob of lift that
Yep.
you're gonna run into.
Again, light thermal day. Am I going to go down here to look for lift? Why not?
Water.
Water. Right. Generally speaking, probably swampy. Much less chance of finding it. So, okay. Now, let's say it really gets low, and I'm going to have to give up the high ground, and I'm still safe for a pattern, right? Now, let's just actually focus. Again, I know it's a little blurry, but I've got a little something going on in here. I've got a road that comes up from a little spine, little villagey thing here. Now, what am I doing? Well, I'm not landing yet, Bobby.
I'm only thinking about where's the closest bar.
And actually, the really bad news, Bobby, and you know this because I think you've lived, that's a dry county. So Bobby is actually not ever going to let himself get in this position. That's not it.
Eric,
Yeah,
I
Dan.
want to say something about bubbles and triggers.
Hang on.
Bubbles and triggers.
Yeah, just hang on a second. Cookie?
One thing I learned early on, over a ridge, even if it's not really a ridge day, but any discontinuity in the ridge, be it a crevice,
Exactly.
or power lines, or a
Yeah,
groove or whatever,
Yeah.
is a good spot to go while you still have.
absolutely.
Also, thermal, think of discontinuities. Turn them upside down, and where would water be on the ceiling? Where does it drip off?
Right.
It drips off the bumps. Thermals do the same thing. They drip upward off the bumps.
Right. Yep. So great story. George Moffett, and many of you know who George Moffett is? Probably one of the most famous glider pilots ever, and most successful world soaring pilot from the U.S. I'm flying with him years ago, about 10, 15 years ago, on a thermal day, very much like this, but later in the afternoon, and actually not far from here. And we're at 6,000 feet. That's the working band. And he goes, and he's flying his discus, and he, boom, good one, bounces it, keeps going. We're down to 5,000 feet. Keeps going, boom, hits another good one at 3,500 feet, keeps going. And he's just going like a bat out of hell, and he's just flying at a very constant, very, very direct. He's flying for the big power line cut through on the Tuscarora. And it's me, another very good pilot, Jay Walker, and there. And we get there, it's 7 knots. We've been taking 3 or 4 most of the day. It's like he knew what was happening, but he was paying attention to a feature, and he was willing to go low. Now that's a tactic or a strategy that I'm not pushing, but he knew that power line cut through, going over a ridge, and a big wide one too, not a little one. This was multiple high tension lines with rocks facing in the sun and a little bit of wind on it. So, you know, I'm looking for anything like that here. I also, if I have to give up the high ground, I'm hoping that maybe this, I think this is a little high ground here, a little thing like here, this little bump, because I'm probably landing in this, actually this is an airport right here, by the way. That's a grass strip, so I've got a nice airport there. But I'm really focused on where do I think this little trigger is going to be. Is there a guy plowing his field? That would be wonderful, right? Is there a bigger road where there's trucks passing through? Is there something that's going to trigger that last ditch thermal? So that's the kind of stuff, and again, you can't learn this stuff by rote, but hopefully what's washing over you is I'm looking outside the window and I'm paying attention to what's happening. And Daniel, you had a point about bubbles and triggers?
Oh, they're just saying that, you know, that basically there's two parts to this, right? One is that, you know, I like to think of the fields or whatever the sources are as kind of charging up a battery of sorts. And then, but then you have to find the place that's going to, you know, basically cut it loose. And so that field might be, you know, might be heating up very nicely. But then if there's a little bit of wind, that tree line might be what's going to kick it off.
Yep. So anything where something changes, there's a story in a Helmut Reichmann book about him being really low and he sees a pile of rocks that the farmer had cleared in the and thrown them at the end of the field. And that was the last ditch. He flew to that and that's where it goes. So, you know, oftentimes when you're down low, Kathy said earlier, this is where you're going to see the vultures or the hawks. If you see a bunch of vultures circling in a spot, you know, that's, at this point, that's your best guess. So, anyway, I think that is,
What ridge is this?
that is the backside of Mahantango. Yeah, so this is, Buffalo Mountain is over here. This is just about to cross the Susquehanna, going that way. So I think, you know, that if I could kind of wrap up, that is the big picture. It's out the window. It's paying attention to wind, paying attention to terrain, pay attention to the clouds, you know, pay attention to the shadows. All the good stuff happens out there in nature. Nothing good happens in the cockpit, especially when I'm flying. And really, you know, start to build a mental map as you do this. The really good pilots that you fly with, the ones that get good fast, do this the best. And it's not just studying the maps and doing the stuff that Daniel does, which is even over the top. The people that just pay attention while they're flying and are kind of building this mental library of stuff are the ones that are gonna get good at cross country and going faster. So I'll open up for what, a couple minutes, 2 questions, sure. And we're done. Bill.
Can you go back to the slide with the cumulus cloud that we were looking at?
Sure.
Generated?
Yep. The diagram or the
No, the photo.
the photo from?
There it was.
Whoops, sorry. That one.
The cloud on the right.
Yeah.
Now, I'm looking at that, and a good flat bottom. I don't have a really good, you know, hard edge at the top. You know, I don't see anything dumping at the bottom. What makes you look at that and say, okay, that's a degenerating cloud versus that's a young cloud that's in a process of development?
It's getting a little fuzzy around the tops and the edges.
So that hard edge.
The bottom's pulling in.
Yeah.
That's one clue. That cloud actually, if you look at that, if I'm in the cockpit there, that's not a climbing cloud, that's an extender cloud.
That's a bumper.
I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna go to that cloud, I'm gonna slow down just before it, I'm gonna bump it to extend in order to glide to the far cloud.
Exactly. We're already pretty high.
Probably not gonna climb in that cloud.
Exactly. We're already pretty high. And that's the other thing, is it's probably still working a little bit up high. If I was 1,000 or 2,000 feet lower, that cloud's already dead to me, because it's probably quit.
So that harder edge on the top is really a big clue on that.
Well, at the bottom too.
In the bottom, of course.
Like, it's hard to see because everything blurs here,
Yeah.
but I'd say that one over here,
Yeah.
there's a lot more definition in that little bubble there.
It's streeting out there, it looks
Yep.
like too. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And again, you'll figure out by trial and error on any given day. But I had some pictures in there from up in the Catskills where there's a street where, I mean, they're just, like somebody took a black marker and drew the bottom. I mean, it's like, boy, is that looking good, right? If it's got that kind of definition and it's really dark and it's got really, it looks like somebody drew it. Yeah, those are gonna be better. Fitch used to call stuff like this. He used to call these steamers.
Yeah, right.
There's moisture there, but there's probably not a lot of heat and not a lot of.
Derek Piggott calls those moistles.
What's that?
Moistles.
Moistles. Yeah. Anything else? before we go to lunch? Yeah.
Especially when you are low, you have to pay attention that the thermals are actually inclined with the wind. So
Absolutely. That's what.
take this into account.
Yeah. When it's blowing hard, you know, again, especially, you know, there's a lot of technique here, but when it's, let's say the wind is gentle from this direction, right? If it triggers here, it's going to kind of come up on an angle, and it's going to be very easy to fly in and out of it and in and out of it. You're going to have to be really good at that speed control and that awareness of where upwind and downwind is. As it gets higher, the thermals tend to open up a little bit, and it gets easier to stay in it. So that's another, I mean, Schwartz is probably going to talk about practicing later, but the ability to stay in weak thermals down low is absolutely critical for long flights.
All right.
All right.
Thanks a million.